Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about characters, concerts, and children. And this is based about, Victorian and Georgian Ulverston and how things may have been at that time. But the first of my subjects is characters. Now, I often wonder today if our pace of life, that there is no time for characters, or is it that we overlook them and they do not have time to form themselves into characters? Well, whatever the cause, I'd like to tell you about some characters from the good old days who lived and made a living in the town. We start with William Moore of Flukeborough, who travelled on foot over the Leven Sands to Canal Foot to sell the flukes he'd caught in the bay. His street cry was, "Now, me young lasses, come out with the dishes. I'll fill 'em full for a trifling, with fine, fresh flukes, alive, alive, oh." Mary Hutchinson, she had a tiny shop in Market Street and sold black puddings, treacle toffee, and on Ulverston fair days, gingerbread donkeys. What about William Jones, whose nickname was Sweet William? He was the seller of birch rods for the chastisement of children. Remember the old saying, spare the rod and spoil the child. Then we have Mrs. Winneray and Mrs. Greaves, two elderly ladies who made their living with public or common ovens. They were lucky enough to have a house with a good-sized oven, and they earned a meagre amount by charging other housewives without ovens to cook their food. They charged sixpence to roast a joint of beef, threepence to bake bread, or twopence to cook a fruit cake. If we lived in the 1870s, we were certain to encounter the eccentric but highly clever Newhoff Clark, better known as Natty Clark. He had a freak mathematical brain. He could recite Shakespeare at will and accurately date any historical event worldwide. He was reputed to hold the world record for running backwards down King Street. His home was with his family in the Commercial Hotel in Upper Brook Street, where his father, the landlord, always maintained that his grandfather was Colonel Frederick, son of Theodore, the King of Corsica. Natty died in 1898 and was described as an endless source of amusement to his many friends. Around the time of Natty's death, a less pleasant character arrived in Ulverston from Austria and took up residence at Lund Hall. The Countess Leiningen was a haughty, determined, domineering woman who kept her servants short of food to the point where they often ran away at the dead of night. She had a reputation for not paying her bills and never went to town on market days, as she considered it was Peasants' Day. However, she must have had some attraction, for she had a string of fascinated gentleman friends during her time living in Ulverston. She was best remembered for her fallout here inside the church, and I'd like to read you part of a newspaper report from April 1902. The newspaper report is headed, "A Scene in Ulverston Parish Church." An extraordinary scene was witnessed on Sunday morning during divine service, a dispute as to the occupancy of a large pew. Mr. Alfred Aslett, General Manager of the Furness Railway, on one hand, and the Countess Leningen on the other, both claiming the right to sit in a certain pew. Mr. Aslett had previously gone so far as to employ 2 men to go to church early and sit in the pew, thus reserving 2 places for himself and his wife. On this particular day, as the 2 men left the pew to make way for the Asletts, the Countess, already seated, shuffled along the pew and left only 1 space. A church warden came over and tried to push the Countess back, but she complained loudly that he had injured her arm, and Mrs. Aslett complained that the Countess had forced her elbow into her side. At the end of the church service, the ensuing commotion astounded the rest of the congregation. Both parties' solicitors were engaged as Mr. Aslett accused the Countess of brawling in church, and the Countess accused the Asletts of assault. Not long before the outbreak of the First World War, she suddenly left the area and, presumably, returned to her homeland. If we were able to scroll back right now to the mid-1600s, we would witness yet another dispute in this very church, when George Fox, the father of Quakerism, visited here to put his religious point of view forward to the gathered congregation. He had not been invited, of course, but interrupted the vicar, Reverend Lampitt, who was holding forth from his pulpit, and it didn't go well for George Fox, who wrote later. "Suddenly, the people were in a rage and fell upon me, knocked me down, kicked me, and trampled me. And such was the uproar that some tumbled over their seats for fear. At last, Justice Sawrey came and took me from the people and led me out and gave me to the constables and other officers, bidding them to whip me and put me out of town." Characters in life could also be characters after they had passed away. Well, how could this be? The inscriptions on their tombstones tell us what they were like. Here are a few examples from English churchyards. "Beneath this stone, a lump of clay, lies Isabella Young, who on the 24th of May began to hold her tongue." Or this one, in a similar vein. "Here lies a woman, no man can deny it. She died in peace, though she lived unquiet. Her husband prays, if e'er this way you walk, you'll tread softly, for if she wakes, she'll talk. here's a simpler inscription, but quite to the point. Here lies Johnson the cobbler, by death stricken dead. He lived poorly, he died poorly, and was buried poorly. Now we'll leave the churchyard and visit some nearby streets to look at the tradesmen and shop owners. In Union Street in Victorian years, Mr. J. Threlfall owned his piano and music warehouse. He had choice specimens of violins in stock. And speaking of specimens, just around the corner in Market Street was a small shop owned by James Kirby, who was in business in the 1850s as a barber and bird stuffer. The Victorians loved shooting things, and he stuffed the animals and birds brought to his premises by the local gentry, plus freak animals such as the two-headed, seven-legged kitten born at a local farm, which was stuffed and put on display as a specimen in Mr. Kirby's shop window. Today we can walk up Market Street and opposite New Market Street, pass under the archway on the right where a sandstone plaque high up in the wall proclaims it to be Brazier Fells Yard. There is a sad story attached to this particular family, found in the pages of the Lancaster Gazette in the spring of 1803, where a public notice stated, Agnes Fell, widow of James Fell Brazier, respectfully acquaints the public that she intends to carry on the above business of her late husband. And then, almost exactly 5 weeks later, we read, died Agnes Fell, widow of the late James Fell Brazier, aged 43 years. And then finally, a few days later, another notice. Dorothy Nicholson informs the public and friends of the late James Fell Brazier, deceased, that she intends carrying on the above business on behalf of the 6 orphan children left wholly to be supported and maintained by her. For our final character from the Victorian times, we must include William Bushby, better known as Billy Bush. He was small in stature, barely 4 feet high, an enthusiastic drunkard who lived mainly in Ulverston workhouse. The master of the workhouse claimed that Billy was not destitute and should not be allowed to stay there, but Billy replied, "You know, I save them a fortune in the workhouse. I cook, I paint, I whitewash, and do many things. It was only fair," he said, "that the county should pay the expenses of his holiday trips to Preston, that is, Preston Prison." Unfortunately, when he happened to earn a few bob, he went straight to the nearest pub and drank the lot. He was a regular in Ulverston Magistrates' Court in the 1850s and 60s for being drunk in the street, where he showed no remorse or penitence relating to his exploits, and he was jailed 24 times over the following years, serving sentences which involved hard labour, but usually with a smile on his face. In 1858, Billy entered as a heavyweight in the Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling event, and a news report in the Westmoreland Gazette stated, "Much merriment was caused by a very diminutive little fellow known as Billy Bush, measuring about 3.5 feet high, who was drawn against a 15-stone man. The large man refused to fight him, whereupon Billy expressed his joy in numerous pranks. Billy died in 1874, possibly of liver failure. If we were to walk around Mill Street, besides the town mill, we would see a large building known as the Emmanuel Christian Centre, but originally built as the Victoria Concert Hall. James Barnett, a local businessman, saw a niche in the market for a public hall and built his concert hall in the 1830s. Since then, the building has been used as a drill hall, as an electroleum, which is a good name for a cinema, in living memory, an egg packing station, a motorcycle showroom, before becoming the Christian Centre. In 1856, there was a report in Solby's Ulverston Advertiser about a musical concert held there by Miss Brewer. And this is what it said. "We have already written of Miss Brewer as a celebrated harpist, but in our humble opinion, please let her confine herself to her skills on the harp. Her vocal attainments are not of sufficient high order to create pleasure or applause." Well, I don't suppose Miss Brewer was very pleased to read that the next day. If a musical concert did not inspire the working class, then perhaps they might have been interested in the Band of Hope concert, which described itself as an evening of first-class entertainment. The songs included Mr. Harding singing "The Dying Child," followed by "Poor Tommy" by Mrs. Mawson, and the finale of "The Drunkard's Looking Glass." All, I'm sure, really uplifting family entertainment. Following on from the title of the last song, "The Drunkard's Looking Glass," I might mention here that at one period in Victorian Ulverston, 1864 to be exact, it was stated that there are more public houses in Ulverston than in any other town in the United Kingdom. We did have a lot, around 64. This was probably because the canal, opened in 1796, brought in many sailors and seamen, followed in 1855 to 1857 the building of the Ulverstone and Lancaster Railway, and railway navvies were notorious for their ability to drink ale and spirits. Also, iron ore miners and iron furnace employees congregated in the town to slake their thirsts. Here are the names of a few of those old pubs, mostly long gone: the Ship, the Flying Donkey, the Struggling Man, the Cross Keys, the Flowing Jug, the Dolphin, the Anchor, the Letters Inn, the Union Jack, the Sportsman's Inn, and the Bugle Horn. But back to the concerts. In those Georgian and early Victorian years, Ulverston was a popular wintering place for the well-to-do who moved into the town in those dark months to enjoy the entertainment provided by a variety of small theatres and assembly rooms, and there was also cockfighting in the Gill. The Theatre Royal, as it was grandly named, stood in Theatre Street, and today it is quite difficult to imagine Harrison Coward's sale room as a high-class entertainment centre. Built in 1801, it consisted of a pit with stalls at the side, a gallery above, which ran round three sides. The theatre was often hired by travelling companies who put on plays for around a week or 10 days, then generally did a bunk without paying their bills. Theirs was the standard fare. In 1807, She Stoops to Conquer. In 1810, the Animal Magnetism, and that included songs such as All My Eye and Peggy Martin, and Each Has a Lover But Me. Above, on the next story, was the assembly room, which was used for autumn and winter balls, usually limited to the gentry, where the cost of a ticket was beyond the reach of the working classes. Here in the assembly room, you could always be taught how to dance, as an advert of 1857 shows. Mr. W.P. Walsh announces to the young ladies and gentlemen of Ulverston that he has commenced a dancing class every Monday, Wednesday and Friday evenings, 8 to 10 p.m. In 1864, there was a grand Masonic ball held in the Victoria Concert Hall, which all the big wigs attended. Miles Kennedy of Stonecross, H.W. Schneider of Abbotswood, and Robert Hannay of Springfield Mansions. George Remington and Henry Barber, to name but a few, and Norwood's celebrated quadrille band had been hired to make the evening go with a swing. At the other end of the scale were the old wife hakes, held between Christmas and New Year in some of the local pubs. A real knees-up night for all the labourers, their wives and sweethearts. Here, to the music of an Irish fiddler or two, you could let your hair down and dance until the early hours of the morning, then stagger down the road to your place of work and arrive there just about on time. By the time you reached early adulthood, the age when you were allowed to attend the public houses and the old wife hakes, you had probably already worked for 10 years, because children of labouring families were expected to work from around the age of 6. That is, until the Factory Act of 1833, which forbade children working under the age of 9 years. When those children went out to work, there was no easy day for them. They worked a 10-hour shift before returning home. This was seen as nothing unusual. It was the way of life. If they didn't work, stated one 19th century factory owner, what were children but surplus population? Which seems very harsh words, even for those long gone days. Obviously, if children were working from 6 years upwards, then schooling, learning to read and write, was out of the question. It was also unlikely that your working working class parents could afford to pay the small fee needed for schooling. So where did those children work in Ulverston? There were the cotton and weaving mills in the Ellers, Ellers High Mill, Ellers Mill and Ellers Low Mill, and also Low Mill, better known to us as the Tan Yard in South Ulverston, and the biggest local cotton mill at Backbarrow, later called the Blue Mills, and now the Whitewater Hotel. This cotton mill had a poor reputation for taking care of its young resident employees, aged between 9 and 13 years, who really, along with other apprentices, can I call them, in other mills throughout the country, were really just slaves. Other local places for employment included the iron ore mines, slate quarries, or, of course, the sea, taking employment of one of the ships regularly sailing from Ulverston Canal. Even in comparatively recent years, youngsters worked hard in service, working, as my mother would have said, as skivvies. And here is a recollection written by Rose, aged 14 years. She was taken on as a maid at the Ulverston Hiring Fair in 1907, and she well remembered her first Christmas in service. This is what she had to say. Christmas came and we had a lovely dinner, very nice. And then the lady of the house came to me and she said, "Have you finished, Rose?" And I said, "Yes, madam, I've washed up and all's nice and tidy in the kitchen." "Oh, well," she said, "you see that ball of string there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Will you go down to the outside toilet?" "The toilet?" I said. "Yes," she said. "Will you go down to the outside toilet?" Now, this was an earth closet toilet down the field, not close to the house. She said, "I want you to go down there and make some toilet papers." There was no toilet paper as we know it in those days. They were newspapers that were torn up into squares. "I want you to go down there and make some toilet papers. There's the needle, and there's the string, and you can thread it up. And on the back of the door, you'll see a nail, and you can hang it on there." So I went down the field, and I sat there all afternoon, and I shed a bucket of tears, thinking about my mother and my sisters all enjoying themselves, and here was I, sat on this toilet, threading toilet papers. At 4:30, she came and said, "Have you finished, Rose?" And I said, "Yes." So she said, "Come in and have some tea now." I had my tea, and I went to bed. It broke my heart, it did, and I thought, if that's my Christmas, I've had it. Finally, if you were to leave this church in the mid-1850s, here is a small selection of businesses you might pass on your way home. Fresh, healthy leeches, constantly on hand at Mrs. Middleton's, the Gill, Ulverston. Or perhaps elder wine. William Stamper has about 50 gallons of very prime spiced elder wine, made last year, price 4 shillings and 8 per gallon. And Jane Penny, cotton and flannel shroud maker, Soutergate, Ulverston. Orders neatly executed at the shortest notice. So thank you for listening today. If you'd like to discover more about these characters, local heroes, and the people of bygone days, why not buy a copy of our brand new local history book, The Stones That Speak, on sale now at the back of the church. Thank you very much.